A man won the highest literary prize on earth for writing about a family destroyed by its own father. And then, in real life, destroyed all three of his own children. He was the son of a morphine addict and a famous actor. He created the most honest tragedy in the history of the American stage, and he could not say "I love you" to a single one of the children who carried his name. How does a man who understood human pain more deeply than almost anyone who ever lived inflict that exact pain on his own son, his other son, and his only daughter? His name was Eugene O'Neill. He won the Nobel Prize. He won 4 Pulitzers. He is, by near universal agreement, the greatest playwright the United States has ever produced. He had 3 children. By the time the century was done with them, 2 of his children were dead by their own hands, and the 3rd had been cast out of his life forever for the crime of falling in love. 3 things tonight that the literature courses never tell you. 1. The razor in a cottage in Woodstock, New York, in September of 1950. And the 4 words a brilliant Yale professor wrote before he used it. 2. The window in Brooklyn, in June of 1977. And the small white coffin, 29 years earlier, that had already broken the man who jumped from it. 3. The letter an 18-year-old girl never received from the father who had decided she no longer existed. Most people remember Eugene O'Neill as a genius. His children remembered him as the tragedy he could not stop writing. The first thing Eugene O'Neill ever learned about family was that it was a thing you survived, not a thing that saved you. He was born on October 16, 1888, in a hotel room on Broadway in New York City, not a home. A hotel room, the Barrett House, at 43rd Street, because his father was a travelling actor and the family did not have a home in any ordinary sense. They had trains and theatres and rented rooms in cities that changed every week. Eugene O'Neill would spend his entire life moving from house to house, country to country, never settling, and he would die, 65 years later, in another hotel room, 300 miles away. He knew it, at the end. His reported last words were that he had been born in a hotel room and, God damn it, was dying in one. The family he was born into was already a quiet catastrophe. His father, James O'Neill, was one of the most famous actors in America, a matinee idol who had thrown away a serious classical career to play one lucrative role, the Count of Monte Cristo, over and over, for decades, until the money was good and the soul was gone. James was charming, generous in public, and miserly in private, a man who had grown up in such brutal Irish immigrant poverty that he could never, for the rest of his life, stop counting every penny, even when he was rich. His mother was named Mary Ellen, called Ella, and Ella O'Neill carried the wound that would define the entire family. When Eugene was born, in that hotel room, the doctor gave Ella morphine for the pain of the difficult birth. It was common in 1888. No one understood what it did. Ella O'Neill became addicted to morphine that day, the day she gave birth to Eugene, and she stayed addicted, on and off, for more than 20 years. The family hid it. The family pretended. The 2 older boys, and then Eugene, grew up in a house where the mother drifted in and out of a chemical fog, where everyone performed normalcy at the dinner table, and where the unspeakable thing in the upstairs bedroom was never, ever named out loud. Eugene grew up believing, in some buried way, that he was the cause of it, that his birth had broken his mother. He was sent away to boarding school at 7. He learned the family religion early, that love is bound up with guilt, that the truest things cannot be spoken, and that the bottle is where a man goes to survive the people who are supposed to love him. His older brother Jamie taught him that last lesson best. Jamie O'Neill was brilliant, funny, and an alcoholic from his teens, and he drank himself to death before he was 45. This was the family that produced the greatest tragedian in American history. He did not have to imagine tragedy. He simply had to write down what was already in the house. By the time he was 24, Eugene O'Neill had already lived 3 lifetimes and nearly ended all of them. He had dropped out of Princeton after less than a year. He had married a woman named Kathleen Jenkins in 1909, gotten her pregnant, and then abandoned her almost immediately, sailing off to Honduras to prospect for gold, leaving his pregnant first wife behind. The son, born of that marriage in May of 1910, was Eugene O'Neill Jr., the first of the 3 children this story will bury. His father did not see him for years, did not, in any real sense, want to. He spent those years as a sailor and a drunk. He shipped out to Buenos Aires and South Africa. He lived in flop houses on the New York waterfront. He drank in a saloon called Jimmy the Priest's, where a glass of whiskey cost 5 cents and the rooms upstairs cost $3 a month. In the winter of 1912, in a room above that saloon, Eugene O'Neill swallowed an overdose of a sedative and tried to kill himself. He was 23. He survived by accident. And then, the same year, he got tuberculosis and was sent to a sanatorium to either die or recover, and in that sanatorium, flat on his back, with nothing to do but think, Eugene O'Neill decided to become a playwright. It saved his life. It was the only thing that ever did. He came out of the sanatorium and he wrote and wrote and wrote. Short plays at first, staged by a small experimental theatre company on a wharf in Provincetown, Massachusetts. In the summers, the American theatre in 1916 was a wasteland of melodrama and cheap spectacle, exactly the kind of thing his father performed. O'Neill brought something the American stage had never seen. Real people, real despair, the actual texture of how human beings destroy each other and themselves. Sailors, drunks, the poor, the doomed. By 1920, his first full-length Broadway play, Beyond the Horizon, won the Pulitzer Prize. He was 31. By the mid-1920s, he was the most important playwright in America, with a second Pulitzer already won. By 1936, he would win the Nobel Prize in Literature, the only American playwright ever to do so. He had escaped the hotel rooms and the flop houses. He had turned the catastrophe of his family into the foundation of immortal art. And in exactly those same years, while the prizes piled up, he was quietly building out of 3 small children and 2 failed marriages the next catastrophe. The one he would not be able to turn into anything but grief. In the summer of 1929, Eugene O'Neill seemed to have everything his own childhood had denied him. He had married for the 3rd time to an actress named Carlotta Monterey, a beautiful, formidable, controlling woman who organized her entire existence around protecting his genius. She built a wall around him. She managed the money, the houses, the schedule, the visitors. She gave him, for the first time in his life, the silence and order he needed to write his greatest work. He had 3 children. Eugene Jr., by then a strapping, brilliant young man, on his way to becoming a classical scholar. Shane, his quiet, sensitive son by his second wife. And Oona, his only daughter, a dark-haired little girl of 4, the apple of everyone's eye. He had money, fame, and a magnificent house. In the early 1930s, the O'Neills built an estate called Casa Janota on Sea Island, Georgia. Right on the Atlantic, a Spanish-style mansion shaped, fittingly, a little like a ship. From the outside, in those years, it looked like a man who had outrun his origins. A Nobel laureate in a mansion by the sea, surrounded by family, at the height of his powers. But the 3 children were almost never in that house. That was the secret at the center of the golden moment. Eugene O'Neill loved the idea of his children. At a distance, in the abstract, he could not stand them near him. They interrupted the work. So they were sent away to schools, to relatives, to their mothers, to anywhere that was not where the great man was writing. He was, even at his peak, doing to his own children the exact thing his father had done to him. He simply had a bigger house to do it in. There is a play Eugene O'Neill would not allow anyone to perform while he was alive. He wrote it in 1941 in a house in California, and he wept as he wrote it, by his wife's account. Physically wept, day after day, at his desk. It was called Long Day's Journey into Night. It is, by wide agreement, the greatest play ever written by an American. It is about his own family. The morphine-addicted mother, the miserly actor father, the alcoholic older brother, the sensitive younger son who is himself. He put his own dead mother on the stage. He put his own father on the stage. He dramatized, with merciless honesty, exactly how a family with everything talent, love, money, tears itself apart through addiction, denial, and the inability to say the true thing out loud. He understood it perfectly. He could see, with the clearest eyes in American letters, precisely how a father's distance and a family's secrets poison the children who grow up inside them. He could see it in his own childhood. He could not see it in his own house. Because at the very moment he was writing that play, diagnosing, line by line, the exact disease that had destroyed his parents, that same disease was working through his own 3 children, in 3 different cities, and he was doing nothing to stop it. The addiction, the distance, the unspoken love. The fathers who could not hold their sons. He was writing the tragedy with one hand and living it with the other. Eugene O'Neill, at the height of his fame, believed he had finally understood the tragedy of his family well enough to put it on a stage and be free of it. He was wrong. The tragedy was not behind him, locked safely in a play. It was ahead of him in 3 children he barely knew, carrying his name, his blood, his alcoholism, and his terrible inability to love them out loud. The first of them to break would be the one who looked, on the surface, the strongest. The brilliant one, the successful one, the son the world admired. A professor of Greek tragedy, who would die in a way the ancient Greeks would have recognized at once. Of the 3 children, Eugene O'Neill Jr. was the one who was supposed to be safe. He had been abandoned at birth. His father sailed for Honduras before he was born and did not lay eyes on the boy for 11 years. He was raised by his mother, Kathleen Jenkins, and her second husband in a quiet, ordinary, middle-class home that knew nothing of the theatre. And for a while that ordinariness looked like a kind of mercy. The other 2 children would grow up inside the orbit of the great man, in his mansions, under his shadow. Eugene Jr. grew up outside it, and grew up, by every early measure, magnificently. He was huge, tall, broad, athletic, with a booming voice and an enormous laugh. He was brilliant genuinely, exceptionally brilliant. He went to Yale. He studied the classics, Greek and Latin, Sophocles and Euripides, the ancient tragedies. He earned his doctorate. By his late 20s, he was a professor at Yale, a respected scholar of Greek tragedy, a translator, a man who appeared on early educational radio and television to bring the ancient world to a mass audience. He was, for a time, one of the most promising classicists in America. And when he finally met his famous father as an adolescent, then as a young man, something rare and good happened between them. Of the 3 children, Eugene Jr. was the one the playwright actually respected. They could talk. They could talk about Aeschylus, about the structure of tragedy, about literature, as equals. The father was proud of this son, in a way he was never quite able to be proud of the other two. Eugene Jr. took his father's name and wore it with pride. He was the heir, the vindication, the proof that the O'Neill blood could produce greatness twice. He was, in his 30s, a man who seemed to have escaped the family curse entirely. He was a scholar of tragedy. He did not yet understand that he was about to become one. The fall, when it came from everywhere at once. Eugene Jr. had inherited more from his father than the name. He had inherited the drinking. Quietly at first, then not quietly, the same alcoholism that had destroyed his grandmother's husband, his great-uncle Jamie, and was even then loosening its grip on his own father, only because Carlotta had walled the world away. Eugene Jr. had no Carlotta. He had charm, appetite, and a thirst that grew year by year into the thing that runs in O'Neill blood like a second bloodstream. His academic career began to wobble. The brilliant young Yale professor left Yale, the circumstances murky, the drinking a factor. He tried lecturing elsewhere. He tried radio and television work. Nothing held. The scholar who had translated Greek tragedy found himself by his late 30s, a man with a famous name, a fading career. 3 failed marriages behind him, and a drinking problem he could not master. And the father, the one person whose approval had meant everything, pulled away. This is the cruelty at the center of the first son's story. The thing that had made the relationship precious was conditional. Eugene O'Neill respected his son as long as his son was a success, an intellect, a credit to the name. As the son's life unraveled, as the drinking won and the career collapsed, and the marriages failed, the father's warmth cooled into disappointment, and the disappointment cooled into distance. The pride curdled. By the late 1940s, the relationship that had been the best thing in Eugene Jr.'s life had gone cold. He asked his father for money. The famously miserly O'Neill blood, the same instinct that had made his own father James count pennies in a mansion, answered. The help was grudging, or withheld. The son who had once discussed Sophocles with his father as an equal was now, to that father, a problem, an embarrassment, a failure wearing his name. Eugene Jr. moved to a rustic cottage in the woods near Woodstock, New York, alone. Drinking, broke, 40 years old, the most promising classicist of his generation, living in the trees, with the booming laugh going silent and the great career, a ruin behind him. He had spent his life studying how the ancient heroes fall. Now, he was living it. On the night of September 25th, 1950, in that cottage in the woods, Eugene O'Neill Jr. decided to die the way the Romans he had spent his life studying chose to die. He had been drinking. He was alone. The career was gone. The marriages were gone. The money was gone. And the father, the brilliant, distant father whose respect he had craved since he was a boy, meeting a stranger for the first time at 11 years old, had effectively closed the door. He drew a bath, or he sat at the table. The accounts vary on the small details. What is not in dispute is what he did and what he left. He cut his wrists and his ankle, and he opened his veins, and he let himself bleed to death the Roman way, the Senecan way, the death of the Stoic philosophers and the tragic heroes he had translated and taught and loved his entire life. A scholar of antiquity choosing the antique death. There is no way to read it except as a final, terrible piece of scholarship, a man who knew exactly which death belonged to a fallen man of intellect and chose it deliberately. And on a piece of paper, he left behind a note. By the accounts that survive, it carried a black classicist's joke, a last flash of the wit that had made students love him, aimed at himself. Something to the effect of, Never let it be said of an O'Neill that he failed to empty a bottle. The brilliant boy, the booming laugh, the Yale professor, the heir, the one who was supposed to be safe because he grew up far from the great man's shadow. He was the first to go. 40 years old. When the news reached Eugene O'Neill, the father, by then ill himself, locked away with Carlotta, the reaction was, by every account, devastating in its restraint. He grieved. Of course he grieved. But he did not, could not, fully break open even then. The man who had put his own dead mother on a stage and wept as he wrote her could not weep, in any way the world was allowed to see, for his own dead son. He had written, years before, the truest tragedies in the language. Now one had happened in his own family, with his own name on the body, and the great tragedian had no words for it at all. He had foreseen everything except this. You would think the death of a son would change a man. It did not change Eugene O'Neill, not in the way it should have, because at the very moment his first son was bleeding to death in a cottage in the woods, partly from the absence of a father's warmth, the same father was already most of the way through doing the identical thing to his other two children, and the first son's death did not stop it. If anything, it hardened the wall. By 1950, Eugene O'Neill had already all but erased his second son, Shane, and had completely, surgically, permanently erased his only daughter, Oona. We will come to how. The point here is the pattern, the thing that makes this not just sad but genuinely tragic in the formal sense, the sense Eugene Jr. could have lectured on. A man does a terrible thing, sees its consequence in the most undeniable form possible, a dead child, and continues doing the terrible thing anyway, because the flaw that drives him is deeper than his ability to learn. O'Neill retreated further into illness and isolation. His own body was failing him now. A degenerative neurological condition that destroyed his ability to control his hands, so that the man whose entire life was writing could no longer hold a pencil. He had always written in tiny, cramped longhand. Now the hands shook too badly to form letters. The work stopped. The plays stopped. By the early 1950s, the greatest playwright in America sat in a hotel suite in Boston, his hands trembling, his children dead or banished, his second wife controlling every visitor at the door, unable to write the only thing that had ever saved him. He and Carlotta, in those final years, made a decision about his unproduced masterpiece, Long Day's Journey into Night, the play about his own family. He ordered it sealed. It was not to be published until 25 years after his death, and never performed. He could put his parents' tragedy on a stage. He could not bear for the world to see it while anyone who knew him was alive. To connect it to the second tragedy, the one with his own children in it. Eugene O'Neill died on November 27, 1953, in a hotel room in Boston. Born in a hotel room, dead in one. The symmetry he had bitterly predicted. His first son was 3 years in the grave. But the tragedy he set in motion was nowhere near finished. Because his second son, Shane the Gentle, lost, addicted, one still had 24 years left to live. And every one of them would be a slow fall toward an open window in Brooklyn. And there had already been, in Shane's life, one small white coffin that broke something in him that never healed. If Eugene Jr. was the son who grew up too far from the great man, Shane O'Neill was the son who grew up too close, and it destroyed him just as surely by the opposite road. Shane was born in 1919, the son of O'Neill's second wife, Agnes Boulton. He was a beautiful, gentle, dreamy child, sensitive in exactly the way his father had been sensitive, but without the one thing that had saved his father, the work, the iron compulsion to write that had turned Eugene's pain into art and given him a reason to survive, Shane had the family's raw nerves and none of the family's armor. And he had a father who could not bear him. This is the hardest thing to convey about Eugene O'Neill, because it is so far from how we want great artists to be. He was not cruel to Shane in any dramatic way. He was simply devastatingly absent and cold. When Shane was a small boy reaching for his father, the father flinched. When Shane grew into a troubled adolescent, shuffled between boarding schools, never wanted at whichever house his father was living in, failing, drifting, lost, the father responded with lectures, with disappointment, with distance, and finally with a kind of weary contempt. Shane worshipped his father, and his father could barely look at him. There is no childhood wound deeper than that, and Shane never recovered from it. He spent his whole life trying to earn a love that had been decided against before he could speak. He tried things. He tried to be an artist, to paint, to write partly, surely, to win his father's respect the way Eugene Jr.'s scholarship had once won it. He had some talent and no discipline, because discipline is something a father gives a child by believing in him, and Shane's father did not believe in him. He drifted. He went to sea briefly, chasing his father's old sailor mythology. Nothing held. And then he found the thing that finally quieted the pain. Heroin. By his 20s, Shane O'Neill was a heroin addict, and he would remain one through cycles of arrest and rehabilitation and relapse for the rest of his life. The gentle, dreamy boy who only ever wanted his father to hold him became, instead, the thing the O'Neill blood always seemed to find in the end, an addict, narcotizing a pain that the family preferred never to name. In 1944, Shane married a young woman named Catherine Givens, and in 1946 they had a baby, a son. They named him Eugene O'Neill III, the third Eugene. The great man's grandson and namesake, carrying the name forward into a new generation. The baby lived a few months. In early 1948, the infant Eugene O'Neill III died in his crib. What we would now call sudden infant death syndrome, a cause that in 1948 had no name and no explanation and no mercy. The baby simply did not wake up. It broke Shane O'Neill in a way nothing ever mended. Whatever fragile structure he had built, the marriage, the attempt at a life, the small hope that he might be a better father than his own had been, that this tiny boy with the family name might be the place where the curse finally stopped. Collapsed into the crib with his dead son, he went deeper into heroin. The marriage that produced more children later could not survive the addiction and the grief. He was in and out of institutions. He was arrested. He attempted, more than once, to take his own life. And his father, the baby's grandfather, the most articulate man in America on the subject of family grief, the man who could write the death of a child more movingly than any author alive, offered, by every account, almost nothing. No rescue. No warmth. The walls stayed up. A few years later, in his will, Eugene O'Neill made it formal and permanent. He disinherited Shane entirely, cut him off completely, the way he had already cut off the daughter we are about to meet. So Shane O'Neill carried for the rest of his life two unbearable things at once: a dead son he could not save, and a living father who would not save him. He carried them for 29 more years. While his two sons were falling, Eugene O'Neill committed the single coldest act of his life against the one child who had done nothing wrong at all. Oona O'Neill was his only daughter, born in 1925 to Agnes Boulton, Shane's full sister. She was, by every account, enchanting, dark-haired, witty, luminous, the kind of young woman who turned every head in a room. As a teenager in New York in the early 1940s, she became a celebrity in her own right, named Debutante of the Year, photographed in the columns, courted by the brilliant young men of her generation, including the writer J.D. Salinger, who was infatuated with her. Her father loathed all of it. He had walled himself away from the world to write. His daughter was running toward the world, toward glamour, toward Hollywood and nightclubs, and fame toward everything he had renounced. He saw it as frivolous, vulgar, a betrayal of seriousness. The distance between them, already wide, grew into a canyon. And then Oona did the thing that ended it forever. In 1943, at 18 years old, Oona O'Neill married Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin was 54. He was 36 years older than she was, older than her own father. He was the most famous comedian on earth and a figure of constant scandal. To Eugene O'Neill, it was the ultimate humiliation, the ultimate frivolity, his serious name dragged into Hollywood gossip by a teenage daughter marrying a man his own age. He did not attend the wedding. He did not send his blessing. He cut her off financially, legally, and totally. And then he did the thing that defines him more than any prize. He never spoke to his daughter again, not once, for the rest of his life. He refused her letters. He refused contact. When she reached out, the door stayed shut. He decided, at the moment of her marriage, that his only daughter no longer existed, and he held to that decision with the same iron will he brought to his work, all the way to his death, 10 years later. He never met any of his grandchildren by her. He never relented. He simply erased her. Here is what makes Oona's story the most savage irony in the entire O'Neill tragedy. The marriage her father disowned her for the one he was certain was a vulgar teenage mistake. A frivolous girl throwing herself at a dirty old celebrity turned out to be one of the great happy marriages of the 20th century. Oona and Charlie Chaplin were married for 34 years, until his death. They had 8 children. They built a genuinely loving, stable home in Switzerland, the exact thing Oona had never had as a child, the warm and unbroken family her own father had been incapable of providing. By every account, Chaplin gave Oona the steadfast devotion and tenderness that Eugene O'Neill never gave any of his children. She blossomed. She was happy. She was, of the 3 O'Neill children, the only one who escaped the curse, and she escaped it by running directly into the arms of the very marriage her father condemned her for. The daughter, the great tragedian, threw away because he was sure he knew how her story would end, went on to live the one happy life in the family. He was the greatest dramatist America ever produced. He understood the human heart more deeply than almost anyone who ever held a pen. And he was completely, catastrophically wrong about his own daughter. His judgment, his certainty, his refusal to ever reconsider the very qualities that made him an immovable artist, made him a fool about the one child who turned out fine. He died in 1953 without ever knowing he had been wrong, without ever seeing the happy home, without ever holding one of those 8 grandchildren. He went to his grave certain he had been right to erase her. He had written, in Long Day's Journey, a father who could not love his children rightly. He never knew he had just lived the sequel and gotten the daughter's story exactly backwards. Oona escaped. Eugene Jr. was long dead. That left Shane, the gentle, dreamy, ruined second son, to carry the family tragedy alone into the 1970s. He carried it badly, because there was no other way to carry what he was carrying. The decades after his father's death were a long, slow disintegration. The heroin, the poverty, more children he loved but could not properly care for because addiction does not let you. The dead baby always behind him, the disinheritance, the famous name that opened no doors and only deepened the shame of how far he had fallen below it. He drifted through the years a ghost of the beautiful boy he had been, the great American playwright's son, sleeping in cheap rooms, chasing the drug that was the only thing that had ever quieted the pain his father put in him. On June 23, 1977, in an apartment in Brooklyn, Shane O'Neill went to a window on an upper floor, and he opened it, and he jumped. He was 57 years old. He died the way the family died, not the Roman wrists of his scholarly half-brother, but a fall, a window, a sudden end to a pain that had simply gone on too long. The second of Eugene O'Neill's sons to die by his own hand. The gentle one. The one who only ever wanted to be held. 2 sons, 2 suicides, 1 razor, 1 window, 27 years apart, and the same father standing behind both of them. So count them, the 3 children of the greatest tragedian America ever produced. Eugene Jr., the brilliant one, the Yale classicist, the heir his father was briefly proud of. Dead by his own opened veins at 40, with a bitter joke for a final note, having chosen the death of the ancient tragic heroes he spent his life teaching. Shane, the gentle one, the lost one, the heroin addict who buried his own infant son and was disinherited by his father and jumped from a Brooklyn window at 57, carrying to the end a wound his father put in him before he could speak. And Oona, the daughter, erased at 18 for the crime of falling in love, never spoken to again, written out of her father's life with the same iron hand that wrote the plays. 2 of his 3 children killed themselves. The third he killed out of his life by choice, and she was the only one who survived. The man understood tragedy better than anyone in the history of his country. He simply could never understand that he was the one writing it. Of the 3 children, only Oona walked out of Eugene O'Neill's life alive. And the way she did it tells you everything about the kind of damage a cold father leaves behind. She did not walk out angry. That is the part people miss. She walked out at 18, married Charlie Chaplin, and built across the next 3 decades the warmest, most stable family in the entire O'Neill story. 8 children, a long devoted marriage, a beautiful house above a lake in Switzerland, the security and tenderness that her own childhood never contained. By every external measure, Oona O'Neill Chaplin won. She took the one thing her father could never give, and she found it somewhere else, in the arms of the very man he disowned her for. But you do not grow up the daughter of Eugene O'Neill and come away unmarked. Because here is the quiet, devastating fact underneath Oona's happy marriage. She married a man 36 years older than she was. A man older than her own father. She married, in other words, a father. A strong, certain, protective older man who would adore her, organize the world around her, and never, ever leave. Charlie Chaplin became the father Eugene O'Neill refused to be, and Oona poured into that marriage the whole unspent need of a girl who had been erased at 18 by the one man who was supposed to love her unconditionally. For 34 years it worked. She leaned on Chaplin completely. She gave herself over to him entirely, her identity, her days, her sense of safety, all built around this towering older husband who had taken the empty place her father left. As long as he was alive, the wound her father made stayed closed. The question no one asked, in all those happy years in Switzerland, was a simple and terrible one. What happens to a woman who survived her father by replacing him on the day the replacement dies? Charlie Chaplin died on Christmas Day, 1977. It was the same year Shane O'Neill jumped from the Brooklyn window. Within a span of months, the last of the O'Neill family's 2 living tragedies reached their ends, the brother by suicide in June, and in December, the husband who had been Oona's whole foundation, gone in his sleep at 88. and the woman who had survived everything came apart. Oona was 52 when Chaplin died. She had spent 34 years organized entirely around him. And when he was gone, the structure that had held her up, the older man, the certain father figure, the wall against the world collapsed. And there was nothing underneath it but the original wound, as raw at 52 as it had been at 18. The father had abandoned her once by choice. Now the husband who replaced the father had abandoned her by death. The same hole opened up again, and this time there was no Chaplin to fill it. She turned to the thing the O'Neill family always turned to. The bottle. Oona O'Neill Chaplin, the luminous debutante, the survivor, the one who got away, descended in the years after Chaplin's death into alcoholism. The same alcoholism that ran like a second bloodstream through the whole family, through her grandfather's household, through her great-uncle Jamie, through her father in his youth, through her half-brother Eugene Jr., a thread of self-destruction, reaching back to the morphine the doctor gave a woman in a Broadway hotel room in 1888. It found Oona too. In the end, it simply waited until she was alone. She drank. She grew reclusive. She had brief, sad attempts at new relationships, including a strange, painful infatuation with a much younger man that her own children watched with grief. The warm Swiss house grew quiet. The woman who had escaped the O'Neill curse by running into a happy marriage discovered, at the end, that the curse had only been waiting for the marriage to end. She had not escaped it. She had outrun it for 34 years. Oona O'Neill Chaplin died on September 27, 1991, in Switzerland, of pancreatic cancer at the age of 66. She was the last of Eugene O'Neill's 3 children to die, and in a sense she carried all of them with her to the end. She had outlived Eugene Jr. by 41 years. She had outlived Shane by 14. She had outlived the father who erased her by 38. She was the survivor, the keeper, the last living person who had been a child in that family, and she spent her final years drinking against a loss that had 2 faces, the husband and the father, the 2 old men who had each, in their own way, defined her by leaving. Think about what that means. The one O'Neill child who lived a long life, who had the happy marriage, who seemed to beat the family fate, even she died of it, slowly, in the bottle, mourning the father-shaped hole that had been at the center of her since she was 18 years old. The curse did not skip her. It just took the scenic route. But Oona left something the others did not. She left 8 children, Eugene O'Neill's grandchildren, the generation he never met, never held, never acknowledged, because he had decided their mother no longer existed. Among them, Geraldine Chaplin, who became a celebrated actress in her own right, and a line of artists and performers who carry, today, the blood of both Charlie Chaplin and Eugene O'Neill, 2 of the most important figures in the history of American performance, joined in a marriage that one of them tried, with all his iron will, to forbid. The family did not end in the cottage at Woodstock or under the Brooklyn window. It continued through the one child the great man threw away. There is a photograph the world will never have. It is the photograph of Eugene O'Neill holding one of his grandchildren. It does not exist because it never happened, not once, with any of them. He had grandchildren through Shane. He had 8 grandchildren through Oona. He died having held, by every account, almost none of them, and having chosen never to know Oona's at all. Sit with the completeness of that refusal. This was not a man who lost touch through circumstance, through distance, through the ordinary drift of a busy life. This was a man who made a decision and enforced it with the same discipline he brought to constructing a 4-act tragedy. When Oona's letters came, he did not open them. When the possibility of reconciliation arose, he closed it. He had a granddaughter, Geraldine, growing up in Switzerland, who would become one of the finest actresses of her generation, blood of his blood, and he went to his grave in a Boston hotel room, having decided she was not his to know. He could imagine, on the page, every shade of human longing. He wrote characters reaching across impossible distances for the people they had lost. He made audiences weep, for 100 years and counting, over families that could not say the loving thing in time. And he could not, in his own life, open a single letter from his own daughter. This is the thing about Eugene O'Neill that should haunt anyone who loves his work. The depth of understanding that made him great was real. He was not faking the compassion in the plays. He genuinely saw, more clearly than almost any writer who ever lived, how families destroy the people inside them through coldness and pride and the unspoken word. He saw it completely. He just could not do anything with the seeing. The understanding lived entirely in the writing hand and never reached the living one. He diagnosed the disease in language so true it became immortal, and he died of the exact disease he diagnosed. And he took 2 of his children with him and exiled the 3rd. Knowledge was not the cure. In the cruelest possible way, his life proves it. You can understand a wound perfectly and still bleed from it. You can write the map out of the dark forest and still die in the trees. Lay the 3 fates side by side, one last time, and the whole shape of it comes clear. Eugene Jr. ran toward his father, earned his respect through brilliance, took his name with pride, talked Sophocles with him as an equal. And when that conditional love withdrew, he opened his veins like a Roman. He died of needing his father's approval and losing it. Shane reached for his father, gentle, worshipful, wanting only to be held, and met a wall his whole life, and numbed the rejection with heroin, and buried his own baby son, and finally went out a window. He died of needing his father's love and never getting it. Oona ran away from her father, was erased for it, survived it, replaced him with another older man, and came apart the day the replacement died. She died of needing a father so badly she spent her whole life filling the hole he left and drank against it when the filling was gone. Toward, reaching, and away. 3 children, 3 directions, 1 father, at the center of all of them, like a fixed dark star. There was no angle of approach that worked. There was no way to be Eugene O'Neill's child and come out whole, because the thing they all needed was the one thing he did not possess. Not talent, not fame, not understanding, but the simple animal capacity to hold a child and say the loving thing out loud. In time, before the window and the razor and the bottle. And here is what the family finally reveals, the truth at the bottom of all of it. He had that capacity once, as a boy, reaching for his own morphine-lost mother in a house full of secrets. He must have had it, every child does. It was trained out of him by his own cold, counting father and his own absent, addicted mother. In the exact way he would later train it out of nothing, because he passed the wound forward without ever once managing to break it. The morphine in a hotel room in 1888 was still doing its work in a Brooklyn window in 1977. 3 generations, 1 untreated wound. The greatest tragedian in American history, who could see everything and stop nothing. There is a pattern in this family, and it does not begin with Eugene O'Neill. It begins in the Irish famine and the immigrant poverty that made his father James, a man who could never stop counting pennies, even in a mansion. A man so frightened of want that he chose money over art, the lucrative role over the great career, and taught his sons that love and security were things to be hoarded, rationed, never freely given. It begins with the morphine. A doctor handed a woman in a hotel room in 1888. and the 20 years of addiction and denial and performed normalcy that followed, in a house where the truest thing was never spoken aloud. Eugene O'Neill grew up inside that. He absorbed the lesson the way children always absorb the deepest lessons, not from what was said, but from what was done. He learned that fathers withhold. He learned that the unbearable thing is never named. He learned that you survive your family by escaping into something, the bottle, the sea, and finally the work, rather than by being held by it. And then he did the most human and most terrible thing a wounded person can do. He had children, and he handed them the exact wound, unaltered, that had been handed to him. The wit. Holding father became a withholding father. The unspoken love stayed unspoken. The addiction that ran through his mother and his brother ran on through his sons, and at the end, his daughter. He did not choose this. That is the horror of it. He would have been appalled to see it, written down as plainly as this. He spent his whole genius writing against it. And it didn't matter. The pattern was stronger than his understanding of the pattern. That is what a generational wound is. It is not a thing you can outsmart. It is a thing you have to consciously, deliberately, daily refuse to pass on, and Eugene O'Neill, who could refuse the world everything, could not refuse his children this. The story of Eugene O'Neill is usually told as the triumph of American theatre. The drunk sailor who became a Nobel laureate, the man who dragged the American stage out of cheap melodrama and made it capable of real tragedy. The 4 Pulitzers. The plays that will be performed as long as there is a theatre standing. All of it true. All of it earned in flop houses and sanatoriums, and at a desk where he wept over his own dead mother, and turned the weeping into something that will outlive every one of us. But that is not the whole story, and the part we leave out is the part that matters most to the people watching this tonight. The whole story is 3 children, a brilliant son who opened his veins, a gentle son who went out a window, a daughter erased at 18 and slowly drowned at the end. The whole story is a man who understood the human heart more deeply than almost anyone who ever lived, and could not, with all that understanding, manage to open one letter from his own daughter, or hold one of his own grandchildren, or say, "I love you," to a single child who carried his name. The lesson is not that genius is dangerous, though it can be. The lesson is darker and far more useful than that. The lesson is that understanding a wound is not the same as healing it. Eugene O'Neill understood. He understood perfectly. And it saved no one, not his children, not himself. You can read every book. You can name your damage with total precision. You can write the truest map ever drawn of the dark place your family lives in. And then you can walk straight back into that dark place and do to your own children exactly what was done to you, because insight lives in one part of a person and action lives in another. And the bridge between them is not knowledge. The bridge is the daily, deliberate, unglamorous choice to do the warm thing out loud in time. That is the thing O'Neill never built, and every family carries the materials to build it or to fail to. At the beginning of this story, 3 things were promised. The razor in a cottage in Woodstock in September of 1950, and the 4 words a brilliant Yale professor wrote before he used it was Eugene O'Neill Jr. 40 years old, the classic scholar, the heir, the only son his father ever briefly respected. He cut his veins the way the ancient tragic heroes he taught had cut theirs, and left behind a black classicist's joke about never letting it be said that an O'Neill failed to empty a bottle. He died of his father's withdrawn approval, in the most learned suicide note in American letters. The window in Brooklyn, in June of 1977, and the small white coffin 29 years earlier, was Shane O'Neill, 57. The gentle heroin-addicted second son, who in 1948 had buried his own infant son, Eugene O'Neill III, dead in his crib of a cause that had no name in that era. That dead baby broke something in Shane that never mended. And his father, the most eloquent man alive on the subject of family grief, offered nothing and disinherited him. And, 29 years later, Shane opened a high window and stepped out. And the letter, an 18-year-old girl, never received. There was every letter Oona O'Neill ever wrote to the father who erased her in 1943 for marrying Charlie Chaplin. He never opened them. He never spoke to her again as long as he lived. He never met her 8 children. He died certain he had been right about her, and he was catastrophically wrong. Because the marriage he disowned her for was the one happy marriage in the entire family, 34 years of the exact devotion he himself had never been able to give anyone. 2 children dead by their own hands. 1 child erased by their fathers. And a Nobel Prize, won for a play about a family destroyed by a cold father and an addicted mother. Written by the man who was, at that very moment, destroying his own children the same way. He could not stop writing the tragedy, because he could not stop living it. Somewhere, the play still runs. Tonight, in some theatre in some city, the curtain is going up on long day's journey into night. The morphine-lost mother is drifting down the stairs. The penny-counting father is dimming the lights to save on the electric bill. The 2 sons are drinking in the dark, circling the love they cannot say. The audience is leaning forward, the way audiences have leaned forward for nearly 70 years, recognizing every one of them some piece of their own family in the family on the stage. That is why it never closes. That is why it is immortal. Because everyone watching has a version of that house inside them. Eugene O'Neill built that. Out of his own childhood, out of the deepest honesty any American writer ever reached, he built a mirror that every family on earth can see themselves in. And he died without ever once turning that mirror toward the family he made. He went to his grave in a Boston hotel room in 1953, his hands shaking too badly to hold a pencil, the unproduced masterpiece sealed in a drawer, his first son 3 years dead, his second son lost to heroin and grief, his daughter erased and forbidden, his grandchildren unmet and unwanted. The greatest tragedian America ever produced, alone with the one tragedy he could never bring himself to write down, the one with his own name on every grave. The play about his parents made him immortal. The play about his children he never wrote. He just lived it, and let it end the way all his plays end in the dark, with the loving word unspoken, and everyone too late. There is a question this story does not answer. It is not, was he a great writer? He was the greatest his country produced, and nothing in these 3 deaths takes a single word of that away. The plays are not diminished by the man. If anything, they are deepened, unbearably, by knowing what he knew and what he could not do with the knowing. The question is older and quieter, and it is the one his 3 children were asking, from 3 different directions, their whole short or sorrowing lives. If a man can see the wound this clearly, see exactly how a cold father breaks his children, see it well enough to make the whole world weep over it, why can't he simply stop, turn to his own child, and do the warm thing instead? The answer, the terrible answer this family gives us, is that seeing is not the same as doing. That the part of us that understands our damage and the part of us that lives it are 2 different rooms, and a person can spend a whole brilliant lifetime in the first room and never once walk into the second. But you can. That is the only gift in this entire dark story, and it is meant for you watching tonight. Eugene O'Neill could not cross from understanding to action, and it cost 3 children their lives or their peace. You are not him. You are watching this, which means you are already standing in the doorway between the two rooms, the seeing and the doing. And unlike him, you still have time to walk through it. So walk through it. If this story moved you, there is a reason. Somewhere in your family, there is a wound that no one ever named. A father who could not say it, a mother who drifted away into something. A pattern of cold or distance or addiction or silence that came down to you from people who got it, from people who got it from people, none of whom chose it, all of whom passed it on. You may understand it perfectly. You may be able to name it with the precision of a scholar. You may have read every book and sat in every therapist's chair and mapped the dark forest of your own family better than anyone. Eugene O'Neill did all of that. He understood his wound better than any human being of his century. And it saved not one of his children, because understanding was where he stopped. Don't stop where he stopped. Tonight, not tomorrow, not when it's easier. Tonight there is a letter you have not opened, or a call you have not made, or a loving word you have been holding in the back of your throat for years, because the people who raised you held theirs, and theirs held theirs, all the way back. There is a child, or a parent, or a sibling, on the other side of a wall that someone built generations before you were born. Eugene O'Neill never opened his daughter's letters. He died certain, and he died wrong, and he never knew she would have forgiven him, because he never gave her the chance. You still have the chance. Open the letter. Make the call. Say the warm thing out loud, while the person is still alive to hear it, because the razor and the window and the bottle do not wait, and the people we love do not stay forever. And the most articulate man in the history of the American theatre proved, with the bodies of his own 3 children, that knowing better is not enough. Doing better is the only thing that was ever enough. So do it now. While there is still someone on the other side of the wall to hear you, before the long day's journey reaches its night.